So this is Meher Baba of Ahmednagar and the Aesthetics of Religious Symbolism, series of 10 talks by Dr. James Newell, that's me. And this is talk number 2, Birth and Early Life of Meher Baba. And we're going to spend a lot of time on the context of those events, which is colonialism in colonial India and colonialism in Pune, the city of Pune where Meher Baba was born and grew up, and the Zoroastrian community. So, to begin with, welcome. It's about the 6th time I've welcomed you, so you should feel very welcomed. The plan for tonight's talk is to discuss Meher Baba's life, beginning with his birth in February of 1894, up to his first encounter with Hazrat Baba Jan in 1913. We're going to go just before that and not beyond that. So, what I'm going to do is not going to be it's going to be a presentation of facts relating to the life of Meher Baba, but it will not be a typical linear narrative biography, but rather I'll attempt to identify events and activities that support my broader thesis that I went into at length last week. Actually, I'll keep saying last week. It wasn't last week, it was 2 weeks ago. These are every other week. So my aim is to be objective and objectively to identify observable personality traits and establish certain facts about Meher Baba, as opposed to one of the facts about Meher Baba is that he created and established really what we call in religious studies a religious narrative. And as I said last week, I'll use words like religion, religious narrative, reductive, reduction, things like that. This is the language of religious studies. Even religious studies scholars don't like the word religion. I know followers of Meher Baba like it probably even less, but it covers such a broad area, and you never know if you have fixed in your mind that when you say religion it means maybe an institution or it means something else. It covers such a broad area that sometimes it becomes meaningless. Yet, and still, we use that word. So rather than, sometimes I'll try to interchange spiritual and like that, but the main thing is what scholars do in general in order to establish facts that can really be grounded in empiricism or in what we can observe. Then we try to reduce things to try to remove. Now, we don't want to completely remove the religious narrative, because that's something that's part of Meher Baba's behavior in the world, was that he created a religious narrative that people either enter into or somehow have a relationship to him through this narrative. That the narratives are the stories we tell about religious experiences, about religion, that kind of thing. So we want to keep track of that, because the creation of the narrative flows from Meher Baba, but we want to also keep that distinct from what we can observe. When someone enters into the religious narrative, they do so in a way that requires faith and which allows them to become established within the religious narrative. We're going to, while doing this, I'm going to try to remain outside of the narrative, describe the narrative, but talk only about, or at least present as much as I can, observable facts that we can see about Meher Baba's life and work. So, last week, this is the second talk, last week, 2 weeks ago, was the first talk, and we discussed my method or approach, which I just kind of summarized a little bit just there, that I'll be using. And this, having a method is what is required in order to make choices about, there's so much material about Meher Baba, we have to make choices about what we're going to talk about, why, and how we're going to talk about it. So you need to have a method. My approach is primarily, my field that I work in is history of religions, and in that pursuit I'm going to borrow from cultural anthropology as well as the field of aesthetics, and as I say, I've talked about that at length last time, and thanks to our camera person Robin, you can find that on YouTube if you want to refresh your memory, or perhaps if you missed it, go ahead and listen to it there. So, one of the important things about this approach is to establish a context in which events are happening. And you see the map here is of British India. It's an old map, I think 1800s. But the idea is that we want to recognize the complexity of culture and how that complexity affects individual lives within a culture. Nothing is given just so. Everything acts upon on other things, and they work together to create an environment in which, in this case, Mayor Baba's parents lived and developed as individual personalities, and then the culture that they developed at home and in the community in which they lived all impacted young Mayor Wani Rani, who is the focus of what we're going to be talking about. So, excuse me, in recognition of this complexity, I want to begin by looking at the cultural environment in which Mayor Baba's parents, Shahriyar and Shireen, grew up and lived in, and how these cultural influences later impacted young Mayor Wani. So this will include, as I said, looking at colonial India, colonial Poona, as well as some of the nuances of the Poona Zoroastrian community. So, to begin with, way, way back, the artifacts and archaeological evidence suggest that there was an agricultural settlement at Poona dating back at least to the 8th century CE. And interestingly, there's a site my wife Zoe and I went to this summer in Pune that dates back also to that period. It's called the Pataleshvara Caves. It's a Shiva cave. And Mayor Baba, after his encounter with Baba John, we'll talk about that next time we meet, he would go there and just sit for hours and hours and hours in this. It's a beautiful, if you've ever been to Elephanta Caves or Ellora Caves, it's kind of the caves like that, except it's right in the middle of Pune, and it's just got a lovely atmosphere. And there's a shrine of some religious figure right next door. So that dates back to this period of the 8th century. So we know at least that there was an agricultural community, and there must have been someone of means who built these caves. They apparently did not have means for long, because it's interesting, one side of the cave is very beautifully laid out with little temples inside. The other side is not finished. It's completely under. It's like one of those early, or late rather, Michelangelo statues where it's kind of, you can see where the cave begins and then the work had ended. And that is where Meher Baba would sit. It was over this area where it wasn't completed. This according to his nephews, Rustam and Saurabh. So until 1818, Pune was under the rule of the indigenous Maratha Empire. You've heard of Marathi and Maharashtra. Well, this was the empire that was spread out over a lot of India, but the Islamic Sultanate came into Delhi, and little by little the Mughals came, and the Islamic influence spread more and more. This is why you often hear way down in the south of India is where the hardline conservative Hindus are. Well, that's because they were pushed down there by the Mughals. They managed to kind of escape complete colonization by the Mughals, but that's how that was. So by 1599, the Marathas were effectively under the rule, interestingly, of the Islamic Nizam Shah of Ahmednagar. So if you've been to Ahmednagar, you've seen the fort there. Particularly if you stayed at Vilu Villa years ago, you'd go past the fort. Well, this is where the Nizam Shah was, and they had rulership over the Marathas of Pune. In 1818, excuse me, the Marathas fell to the British East India Company in a heated battle for the city. So at this time, the company established, the East India Company established the cantonment or camp area of Pune. And that's significant because that's where Meher Baba grew up. Now, the East India Company effectively ruled India. They were quite powerful. They were effectively an arm of the Indian government, although officially they were a company.
The British government.
Huh?
The British government.
Yeah, the British government.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Zoe is holding her tongue nicely because she knows much more about this than I do. But in any case, after the rebellion, what the British called the mutiny, but the Indians called the rebellion of 1857, the British government took over the East India Company, and which really means that they simply, instead of being paid the armies, now remember that this is a company, supposedly, that were basically, just drawing out, as some call raping India, drawing out all their resources. They had so many resources, so much money. They had their own army. They built all the railroads. They basically were a colonizing force as they were, but they weren't kind of officially a British colony until after the rebellion, and the British government took over, and now they were the ones paying the armies and the people who worked under them. So they then, in 1818, they became the rulers, but then the British government became the ruler of Poona in 1857. And this is all significant, as we'll see if I don't go too far ahead. So this is a map of 1890 of the one area of the camp. It's called the Sadar Bazaar. There's a lot of shops and things like that. This white area in the map, if you can see that, is this huge complex here, which is called the Shiva. Now it's called the Shivaji Bazaar. It had a different name then, which I can't recall. But if you've been to Pune, if you've walked from Meher Baba's house, which was in Butler Mohalla, in this area here, this is now called Dastur, which means priest, Meher Road. They wouldn't call him Avatar, but they figured that we can call him a priest. So they call him Dastur Mehar Road. If you know the area, this is Sachapir Street, and this comes down. This white area is this Shivaji Market, and right down in this area, pardon me, is where Hazrat Baba Jan's shrine is today. But you can see, the point of this is that you can see that if you've been at all in this area has changed very, very little since 1890 when this, what this map depicts. And this, as I say, this is still an operational bazaar, primarily meat market and what have you in Pune. This area here is what's now called MG Road or Mahatma Gandhi Road. It was then called Main Street. Now, this is a map of Pune proper. This map here depicts this area right here. This little line there is this Main Street or Mahatma Gandhi Road now. And this is the Pune area. The train station is here. Deccan College is up here. And Butler Mohalla is right around here. So that's where Meher Baba is one of the areas. All throughout this area, they lived in, the family lived in different places, but basically in that area. So, as the Pune cantonment grew, so did the need for goods and services to supply the growing British community there. So now, again, if you look back at this map, this is what they took over the area, and they won through. There's several names for this area, but it's basically they defeated the Marathas at Kirki, and that's sort of to the east, a little bit north and a little bit east of Pune. And so the Kirki cantonment was where most of the troops were, because that's where they were kind of defending against anybody who decided to come back. But the generals and the governors and the people who ran Pune were in this area, so they were constantly worried about the encroachment. There could be an uprising from the Indians who lived in this area, the Marathas who were still there. These are the Peths. You've heard of Kasba Peth if you've read anything about Meher Baba's early life. The Peths are all in this area. They're these little kind of almost like villages that were within the Pune area itself. So the point being that the British, once they won this battle, they established actual literal military camps, and they little by little, as they stayed there longer, they, instead of tents, they had permanent buildings, and they continued to be the governors of the area. Now, what happened when you do that, you need to, they had, as you can tell from the battles and all that, they had rough relationships with the local people, kind of uneven relationships, but there was a group that had learned how to interact between the locals and the British government, and were able to be sort of in between intermediaries is the word I'm looking for. So, and this is a quote from a nice coffee table book on the history of India. It says, amongst the newcomers, the earliest were the Parsee traders who came from Sirur. Now, Sirur is between Ahmednagar and, it's a long history with Meher Baba and Sirur, but it's between Ahmednagar and Pune. And the Parsees had been in Sirur because they were traders and they were intermediaries, and they would help supply and do business with the British government people who were stationed in Sirur as sort of a backup encampment for the people who were battling over to the east in Kirki. So what they're calling here the Battle of Khadki. So these Parsees, after that battle was won, they began to come up from Bombay and to move from Saror. And the Parsees specialized in a new kind of establishment, which had not been in India previously, which came to be known as Europe shops. Watches, clocks, haberdashery, groceries, textiles were some of the things available in these shops. For the first time in Pune, Parsees also specialized in the sale of European liquor and owned a number of wine stores. The first ice-making factory in Pune, as well as 2 photograph studios, were set up in the bazaar by Parsees a few years later. Watchmaking, bookbinding, carpentry, and coach building were other professions followed by them. As the community prospered, they invested in leasehold land in the camp, that means the cantonment area that I was just showing you, and other property in the civil lines. In other words, anywhere they were British, they would sort of insinuate themselves as sort of helpers to the British. They built houses on these lands to be rented to Europeans who would come for extended periods or shorter periods. And a number of hotels were run by the Parsees. Gradually, the Parsees came to be known to own large amounts of landed property. So this is a group that was neither completely considered to be Indian by the locals. They were considered to be foreigners, and they got along well with the British. So, and they're the Parsees. So who are the Parsees? These are some pictures of a Parsee family during this probably 19th century period, and this is a trader. So Parsees are a particular group of immigrant Zoroastrians who are found primarily in India. Since they've migrated to other places, but they had existed in ancient Persia for at least 1,000 years prior to the Arab invasions of 651 CE, or AD if you prefer. The new Islamic religion allowed for the presence of Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians. That's the new Islamic religions brought by the Arabs. But from time to time, different governmental factions proved less than welcoming to non-Muslims, and there would be pressures, and eventually they decided, well, we're gonna get out of here. So somewhere between 716 CE and 936 CE, large populations of Zoroastrians, who were traditionally the rulers and the inhabitants of what we're going to call Persia or Iran, that area, they began to emigrate from Persia to India, mostly settling in what is now Gujarat state. After several centuries, the Parsees, and Parsees means those from Pars or from Fars, i.e. from Persia. So Parsi, you'll find a lot of, especially in Persian, there'll be an I at the end, and that means one who is from this place. Irani, Baba is called an Irani, and that's because he's from Iran, or his family is from Iran. So they had assimilated well into their new home in Gujarat, and being largely traders and merchants, large groups of Parsees began to settle in Bombay, where business opportunities were plentiful. So why is this important? It's important because of the relationships, as we'll see later, between the Parsees and the immigrant Zoroastrians, who were not Parsees were people who'd been in India for at least several centuries. Usually it had to be almost 800 to 1,000 years they'd been in India. And they had a certain sophistication and a sort of groundedness in the community that the immigrants did not have. So as we've seen, once the British came to power in India, Parsees became closely connected with the colonial government. The Parsees knew a good business opportunity when they saw one, and there were many things about the Parsees that appealed to the British. For one thing, of many things, the Parsees had fewer restrictions about interactions with foreigners. For example, they had no caste restrictions nor vegetarian requirements as the Hindus did. And this was very serious for some Hindus because Mahatma Gandhi would tell the story that when he returned from being educated in Britain, his father would no longer eat dinner with him because now he'd been polluted by being with the outcast or non-caste people, the foreign people. So this was very serious, and a lot of people there'd be all these negotiations that have to go on in order just to even meet and talk with somebody, and this infuriated the British. I thought it was just superstitious and silly. The Parsees also had no restrictions about alcohol or pork, which was a problem for the Muslims. So they always felt frustrated and just thought this was silly for people to take these kinds of superstitious things so seriously. The Parsees didn't have these problems, so they had much easier time working with them. In many ways, the Parsees were much more like the British than any other of the Indian populations. And over time, because of this close relationship, many Parsees aspired to being more and more like the British. So, yes.
Another thing is that in the Parsi community, women were never restricted. They did not have a system of purdah, so it was easy enough for the British women to get to know the Parsi women at parties and
Yeah, there are just
socials.
fewer restrictions, and the atmosphere could be such that the British could still feel superior, and yet they could see that the Parsees were kind of at least aspiring to be like them. So there was still some of this paternal attitude towards the Parsees, but it was far less so than the real begrudgery that they had towards the other native Indians.
Build up a lot of resentment from the Hindu surrounding population to the Parsees?
Yeah.
How was that expressed?
Say it again?
Did that build up a lot of resentment of the Hindus to the surrounding Parsi community because they were getting favoritism from the British?
To a certain degree. I mean, there was a lot of, first of all, just to live in India, people are used to there being different communities. And what's interesting is that the real resentment began once the British were out. Then that was really expressed much more. There's a lot fewer Parsees now in government than there was previously.
What role did the native Jewish population in Pune play? Because there were quite a lot of...
Yeah, there were quite a lot, and then interestingly, I don't want to get too far into that. I was going to do a whole thing on David Sassoon, who's Baba was born, you may know, in...
You know that picture of Baba with his soccer team when he's about...
Yeah, he's got Mickey Nazareth and Isaac Shalom.
Kids are Jewish in that
Yeah,
picture.
yeah. And a lot of them were either employed by or related to David Sassoon, who's a Baghdadi Jew. So he had lived... He also, like the Parsees, he had lived fairly successfully among Muslims in Baghdad, and then eventually that various restrictions were coming in, so he said, well, the heck with this, and he moved to India. Interestingly also, about the Jewish-Parsi connection was that both the Jews and the Parsees tended to establish their fortunes early on in the 18th and 19th century in the opium trade, which a lot of people aren't aware of. I mean, it wasn't illegal, and it was a lot of money to be made. So there's tons to be said about that. The David Sassoon Hospital, the synagogue where David Sassoon is now buried, and he was kind of like a Bill Gates of it, not even Bill Gates, more like someone who has just a million businesses going on and profits from all of them. He was buried in at the synagogue, which is right. Kind of, the streets have different names, but it's basically the same street that I just showed you, David Sassoon, Dastur Meher Road, and there's stories of Meher Baba, little Merwan, riding his bicycle around in the yard of the synagogue.
Just one quick story. Mani told me last time I was in India that her father, of course Meher Baba's father too, had quite a lively relationship with the Jewish neighbors, which were right around, and one day, he went to sleep like any other night day, woke up speaking fluent Hebrew. She swore, absolutely true, she witnessed it, that from then on he was able to speak fluent Hebrew to all the Jews in Pune. In one night he learned
And Baba,
that.
there's a quote, at least from Meher Baba, that this was true, and it was just that he said there are things that people have in them that if you're highly advanced, they come out, and his father is very special. Now, I avoid stories like that, as I said, because I want to separate out religious narrative and what would be hagiographic. Now, I don't have any problem with that being true. On the other hand, if I'm going to present it to an academic audience, I wouldn't choose that story to affirm my argument here. But that is one of the tales that they tell about him. But so we're going to get now into those very people. So having now laid some context and cultural groundwork, we're going to come to the most important direct influences on young Merwan Irani's life, his parents, Shahriyar and Shireen. And this background I've given you on Parsees will more and more, and especially in coming weeks after after this momentous event with Hazrat Babajan, we'll see some of the pressures from the Parsees and why this was so difficult, particularly for Meher Baba's mother, Shireen. So, the story of this couple is a fascinating and remarkable one by any measure. Even when we sidestep what are likely embellishments inserted by well-meaning authors, theirs is just a remarkable story. It seems likely that much of the early life of Shahriyar in Iran, and that I'm talking about the sources that we have to draw from, and most of them have been incorporated into the first volume of Balkal-Shari's book, Meher Prabhu, now called Lord Meher. But there are other sources. There's sources, as you were saying, Mani, it's in Mani's, his Meher Baba's sister Mani's book, Godbrother, and also in David Fenster's book where he interviewed Mani extensively. There are stories that pop up about her family. But the ones that pop up about Shahriyar in Iran tend to be just highly fantastic. They may well be true. The method I try to take, as I was trying to explain earlier, is methodological agnosticism. But I do not focus on these stories simply because they're not going to help to drive forward the narrative that I want to put forward. Like I said, we have to make choices. So I try to tease out. It's natural. It's an important fact that people told hagiographic stories about Shahriyar. Embellished stories. They no doubt have a germ of truth in them, and also there's kind of, when they're told, there's this omniscient eye. You don't really know. No one says, well, Shahriyar told me one time, or someone told me this or that. There's just this kind of, what's the Kipling thing? Just so stories. It's kind of, this is just how it was. So, in any case, I'm going to try to not get into those. But on the other hand, his wife, Shireen, her early life took place entirely in India and primarily in Pune, and those stories seem to be more reliable, although there are, particularly around the birth of Merwan, there seem to be things that may even have been factual, but were just kind of blown up to be miraculous and all that. So again, I'm not making a decision one way or the other, but I'm going to try and parse those out as being part of the religious narrative and stick with what I can identify as being facts. This is what historians of religion try to do when they're reading the Gospels and things like that. They look at things that you wouldn't repeat unless they were true. For example, something like, as we'll see in a moment, the almost bizarre marital arrangement between Shireen and Shahriyar. Very unlikely people would make that up in order to make them seem like normal people. Or even fantastic people. It's too unusual. So a historian would say, well, that's probably true. And they also look for multiple attestations. Many people repeat the same story, or it's kind of, maybe it's got little changes, but there must be a core of something, or so many people wouldn't be repeating it. So that's the kind of, that's the way I'm trying to make choices of what I emphasize in these things. So, Shahriyar Mundagar Khorram Shahi is known to us as Shahriyar Irani. And I was going to bring something tonight that I completely forgot, but I have anyway, ask me about it later when we get to discussion, if we do that. So Shahriyar is his given name, Mundagar is his father's name, Khorram Shah is the village in which he was grown. Remember I said there's an I on the end, so Khorram Shahi means one from Khorram Shah. So Shahriyar was born on March 21st, 1853 in the town of Khorram Shah, Iran, to a poor Zoroastrian family. Shahriyar's father, Mundagar, was the caretaker of the local Zoroastrian Tower of Silence. His mother died when he was 5 years old, and in the absence of his mother, Shahriyar's sister, Perosia, cared for him, who was only just a little older than him. Now, these seem to be likely facts. However, as I said, the narrative of Shahriyar's life continues with a string of tales so fantastic that it is difficult to separate historical fact from hagiographic embellishment. Hagiography is a biography that, usually a biography of a saint, is hagiographic in that it just exaggerates and tries to inspire faith and makes everything seem miraculous. And as I said, I'm going to try and weed those things out and just say what we think could be true. So according to the sources, at the tender age of 12, Shahriyar made the bold decision to renounce the world and leave home in search of God. And the sources say he went to his father and said, "Father, I'm leaving to find God." And they don't say anything about the father's response, but apparently it's like, sure, go on, son. 12 years old, you're walking around Iran. That'll be great. So this is not the kind of parenting that we. So again, something like that is probably true, or else the story wouldn't survive. It's not something you would. Mayor Baba's grandfather seems like he's not very attentive to. He's like, the poor kid's lost his mother, and now he's going to. So, but these are what we can pull out. It sounds like it's probably true that something like this happened. Maybe not because he was searching for God, but one way or another. Oh, another thing that the sources say is that his father. One reason his father wasn't as harassed as some other Zoroastrians was that he was kind of a darvish, kind of a Sufi, and followed a local Sufi saint. And no doubt, the sources say, Shahriyar also came into this man's company. They don't elaborate as to whether he became a follower or if he became a Sufi himself, although they do describe him as a darvish. Now, we're familiar with the word dervish, but dar is a door, means door. And so a darvish is one who goes from door to door. So in other words, he's a beggar, but he's a beggar for God. And of course, it's come to mean much more to that because it's associated with Sufism, but it's particularly asceticism and ascetic Sufism. So there follows in the sources a string of tales describing Shahriyar's 18 years of wandering across deserts and across the countries of both Iran and India, searching for God and being miraculously saved numerous times, just at the nick of time. Some miracle occurs and he's either saved or given some water by someone who then disappears, in various tales. At one point, despairing of ever reaching his goal, he hears, and I spelled hears the wrong way, he hears a voice say to him that it was his son who will achieve the goal he seeks, and through his son, he will then achieve the goal himself. This is what the voice says to him, probably in Farsi. After this event, at age 30, Shahriyar eventually makes it to Pune, where his sister Parsees has emigrated. Now, there's a long narrative that describes each step of the way, and as I say, it's so intertwined with hagiographic, miraculous events that I'm just kind of, you can read it for yourselves. There's two lovely books compiled by the Bombay Meher Baba Center, and apparently, probably mostly by Hoshang Dadachandji, who's Havovi Dadachandji's husband. They're available for like $3 at Shahriyar Press. One is called Shahriyarji, and one is on Shireen Mai. There's some colorful titles under that, but they're basically two little booklets, and they collect all the Lord Meher and Mani stories and other things together. So if you want to read the long narrative of, and it's fascinating, of Shahriyar's wanderings, then those would be good sources.
Is Kevin Shepard's book reliable?
Kevin Shepard's book, is there a book on Shahriyar?
Yes, there was one book just on
Yeah,
Shahriyar.
I'd love to see it. No, I didn't. It probably, he's a very scrupulous scholar. So
And it's
probably,
fairly thick.
Huh?
His book is fairly
Huh.
thick. Yeah.
Well, I've seen the Baba John book and the Baba book, and there's a couple others I've seen. I haven't seen that one.
That one's the largest one, the widest.
Thank you. I'd like to find that. So, Parsees, okay, wait a minute, where was I? Yeah, okay, eventually, yeah. So at age 30, he eventually makes it to Pune, where his sister Parsees has emigrated. So, Parsees is in Pune, he goes to Pune. Parsees, he lives with her for some months, and Parsees is continually chastising him to give up his wandering dervish life and to marry. She's constantly harassing him, and then one day he's so despairing, he just points to a 5-year-old girl walking by and says, "If ever I marry, it will be to that little girl." And that little girl is Shireen, Meher Baba's mother. Now, this is presented in every tale I've seen. It's presented as this random encounter, and yet, as we go through the story, we find that actually if he didn't know who the girl was, certainly his sister did, and it seems to be that they all had the same last name, Khorram Shahi, so it sounds like they probably were from the same village. So there was a connection there of some time. So the little girl is Shireen Khorram Shahi. And this may be incorrect, and I'll explain why in a second. Shireen Khorram Shahi was born in Bombay in 1878 to Gulandun and Dorabji Khorram Shahi. Although the sources do not say so, the family name suggests that they came from the same village as Shahriyar. Now, when he came to India, for one reason or another, he was called Shahriyar. Now, another interesting thing is when, oftentimes, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, when people emigrated, for one reason or another, they'd be given, in order to get into the country and to be legal citizens, they'd be given another name. And as you can see, the name Khorram Shahi means they were from Khorram Shah. So now it seems that all of the immigrant Zoroastrians were called Irani. That's why we see so many Iranis. It's not that they're all related, but they came in and they were given this name. So I'm assuming, I'm calling Shireen Khorram Shahi because that was her parents' name, but I'm assuming, because Shahriyar was now called Irani, and so it makes sense that when he immigrated, they gave him a passport or legal citizenship, and with that, he had to also accept this name, Irani. And the Khorram Shahi is probably the same, so because Shireen was born in India soon after they immigrated, it's probably likely that she was called Shireen Irani. But these are important points, but not vital for our narrative today. So, in any case, the family migrated to India with their 3-year-old daughter, Dawla. Golandun, the mother of Shireen, was pregnant when the family reached India, and shortly after Shireen's birth in Bombay, the family relocated to Pune. Now, why would they go to Pune? The sources don't say, but it sounds like they had a friend, at least one friend, of Shahriyar's sister Pirojsha. And there may have been other people from Khorram Shah, Iran. Again, there may be information about that somewhere, but they weren't in the sources that I had. So, due to the previously described incident, at the end of this tale of Shahriyar, 5-year-old Shireen was engaged to be married to a man 25 years older than her. So imagine you've just immigrated out of your country, and the sources say due to religious persecution, and you've been just 5 years in this new country, and your 5-year-old daughter is now engaged to a man who's 30 years old. This was not, in some parts of the world, certainly in royalty and in other places in the ancient world, this was standard, but it was already, certainly at least going out of practice, that this would be a normal thing. So, Shahriyar's sister Pirojsha was good friends with Golandun, which is another suggestion that they may have come from the same village in Iran, and had gone as soon as he said that, because she was so desperate to get him to stop wandering around as an ascetic and everything. She wanted to settle down and get a job, she's basically a substitute mother since his mother had passed away. So she went and pleaded with Golandun to accept the engagement. This is another thing in the ancient world that we would, just because she said yes. I mean, first of all, Shahriyar says, okay, I'll marry her. And so Pirojsha, and this seems what happened, knew that Shahriyar wouldn't go back on his word. He said he would, and so she knew it was desperate that she convinced Golandun to accept the engagement. Why Golandun accepted this engagement, we don't know, but she did. And Shireen's father, however, when he got home, did not accept the engagement and never spoke to Shahriyar again until more than 30 years later when Marwan was born. So little tensions in the the Sunday dinner there, I think. So Shireen, after 9 years of engagement, when Shireen was barely 14, the source says, and Shahriyar was 39, the two were wed in a traditional Zoroastrian wedding ceremony. Shireen's father, Dorabji, refused to attend the wedding, and by this time, apparently anticipating his upcoming wedding, so it had been 9 years, so Shahriyar had settled down, he'd become an established businessman with several tea shops, and he was selling other goods. In 1893, this was a year after marriage, at age 15, Shireen gave birth to her first son, Jamshed. Becoming a mother at such a young age, Shireen was apparently unprepared for motherhood, and eventually her sister Dawla, remember Dawla was 3 years old when they immigrated, Dawla took over the care of Jamshed, and subsequently Dawla and her husband Fardun, this is Dawla and Fardun here, looking every inch the immigrant Zoroastrian. Dawla and her husband Fardun raised Jamshed as their own son. So in February 1894, Shireen gave birth to her second son, Marwan Shahriyar Irani, who would eventually be known as Meher Baba. Having recovered from her difficulties with her first son, Shireen took enthusiastically to mothering Marwan, and she doted on him as her very special child. In her mind, she developed great plans for his future, and as he grew, he demonstrated every indication that he might well fulfill her plans for him. As with his father, Shahriyar, before him, the stories of Marwan's early life give every indication of much embellishment. What does seem to be, as I said, there's just, you can read in these early accounts, both in Lord Mayher and in these two little books that I mentioned, lovely stories, and no doubt, perhaps 100% true, perhaps just a germ of truth. There's something there, but it's hard to use them as a narrative telling his life, because clearly there's some, it's already kind of been taken up into the religious narrative. So if we want to separate those out, we just want to be careful. I want to be careful about that. So, what does seem to be borne out by the facts is that Marwan was a healthy, intelligent, and in every way normal boy, normal Zoroastrian boy. The stories describe a devout Zoroastrian boy who was initiated into the faith by a traditional Zoroastrian Navjot ceremony at age 10, and this actually, for some reason, was, usually it's done at age 7, they say, and he also, the ceremony was jointly with his brother Jamshed. Regularly he visited the fire temple with his parents, and at home he daily said the traditional Zoroastrian prayers. And another reason I take that as seriously is because you may have heard there are these diaries of Bailey, who is, by every account, Bailey was a childhood friend of Marwan's. By every account, he was just, everybody disliked him, even up to when he was an older man. And he wrote diaries, and but even when he was older, even though he was friends with Meher Baba, he went various places with Meher Baba. He went many times to see Baba John. Both Baba John and Marwan at this time told him not to go to Persia and do this thing, and he did it anyways. He became thrown in jail, and matter of fact, Colonel Irani, who we'll learn about later, who was very much against Meher Baba for many years, actually helped Bailey get out of jail. But the point is that I want to make is that Bailey, throughout his life, didn't believe that it was Baba John or Opasni or anybody who made him a spiritual master. He thought it was because Marwan spent so much time doing his daily prayers as a Zoroastrian boy growing up. So this is why, hearing this from Bailey, who is not only got no axe to grind, but usually tries to embellish things that you wouldn't expect him to embellish, that he would say this gives a little more credence to these stories that he was a devout little Zoroastrian. Merog is what they called it. Shahriyar and Shireen, I think she called him Shahriyar. She called him Shahriyar. It's kind of an og at the end of it. It's little nicknames that people would give in Zoroastrian homes, apparently. And he called her something Shireen Og or Shirog or something, and they called Marwan Merog. So it seems likely that little Merog was indeed certainly a good ethical person. So implicit in Shireen's ambitious hopes for her darling Marwan, nicknamed Merog, was that he would make a place for himself in the hierarchical social life of the Poona cantonment. Now remember, this is really this place is built by Parsees serving the British, and the immigrant Zoroastrians more or less served the Parsees. I mean, that's kind of the hierarchy of how things went there. Just as the Parsees aspired to be more like the British, the immigrant Zoroastrians, or the Iranis, aspired to be accepted by the more well-to-do Parsi community. The Shahriyar Irani family had several social strikes against them already. They were not Parsees, they were immigrant Persian Zoroastrians. Although at least Shireen had been born in India, and one of the stories says how she would say how, thank God I was born in India, at least I'm not as jungly as those people who weren't born. Like, she was only here for like a couple months before she was born, but she would make a distinction, and it literally said that the immigrant Zoroastrians were jungly, but because she was born in India, she was something else. So there's that, and at least Shireen was born in India, but just barely. But Shahriyar, not only was he not born in India, he was known to have a checkered past as a darvish, a beggar ascetic, who is always kind of Yeah, everybody, even the holy people, are kind of skeptical because you don't know if someone's just kind of being a freeloader or if they really got spiritual aspirations. And in addition to that, Dorabji was likely not the only one, Dorabji being Shireen's father, not the only one who found their May, December, or maybe April or March, December marriage scandalous. Shireen felt that Merwan was surely going to be the one who could eventually prove their social value to the Parsi community. And he had, and by all accounts, he was a good student, excelled at school, loved by all his friends, and this is what Ira was talking about. This, I think this one is Mickey Nazareth, and I think this gentleman is Isaac Shalom. So there's a big Jewish community there. There was a synagogue, and there was a well-to-do Jewish community, and Merwan fit in beautifully with them and with the Parsees. He was known to be very popular. He started the group called the Cosmopolitan Club, where people would get together and talk about lofty things. So he really was following the kind of path that an immigrant Zoroastrian would follow and be very successful at if he made the right connections and you know, kept doing what he was doing. Had he kept doing what he was doing, his mother's wishes would almost certainly have been fulfilled for him. Now this is where, when he was first born as a baby, this is where he lived in the Quartergate area of Poona. This is down past, if you're familiar with the area on that map I was showing, this is down past Baba Jan's shrine, farther away from the more bustling bazaar area. This, of course, is, if you've been to Pune at all and visited any of the Mir Baba places, you've seen, this is called the Pumpkin House because of this big stone here, and it's still there. It looks almost exactly, it's been renovated inside, but on the outside it looks almost exactly the way it did in the 1890s, and or rather the early 1900s. And if you're standing there, taking this picture, to your back is the house they lived in later. They called the house with the well, and it's not called Baba House, but that's a house where Baba lived later in his teens after meeting Baba Jan. The whole family lived there, of course, and they kept that house for a long time. And they kept, I think at one point they ended up, Shahriyar and the family would rent the Pumpkin House out and would live someplace else where they could somehow make a profit on that. And then at some point they sold it, and then at another point the family bought it back. So it's now owned by Ahmed and Dara. It was left to them by Mani. Mani had ownership of it before that. Anyways, these are the areas in which little Merog grew up. This is still operated. Last time I was there, at least, there was a shop, may not be the same building, but called Cafe Shahriyar. It's one of his earliest Shahriyar cafes, and it's very near Baba Jan's shrine. So just to give you an idea, again, of where little Merwan grew up and played. He later went to St. Vincent High School, which is here, and he went to, this is the Deccan College. And now again, when you look at this map, they were living, when he encountered Baba Jan, which we'll talk about it in depth next time, he was living down in this area here, if you can see the arrow there, and Deccan College is up here, and it probably was a lot easier. In those days, you'd be lucky not to be killed on a bicycle these days because it's unbelievable traffic. It's just madness. But it was probably easier on a bicycle, but still a long, long way to ride a bicycle to college every day and then ride the bicycle back. And he did that, and when he would go to this end of town, and next time I'll show you pictures of a little kind of it's almost like a row of apartment houses that they lived in at this time between 1913 and 1914. So he would have been coming from the college back home when he was beckoned by Baba Jan to come and see her. And that was right on the street in the cantonment. So Shireen and Shahriyar eventually had 9 children. I think 3 of them died. Jamshed, Franey, and I think actually 4 of them died. I think 3 in infancy, and Jamshed died relatively young, in maybe his 20s or 30s. 6 survived. Shahriyar's business, now when Merwan is in college, as I said, there's lots of lovely stories about his youth that they're so kind of complicated and questionable. I'm not going to get too much into them. But he's in college. Shahriyar's business continued to grow. The future looked good. Shireen was naturally delighted when her precious Merog began attending Deccan College. He was right on the path that she wanted to go in, whether he'd be a doctor or a businessman. Or he would certainly this was going to lead to a wonderful future that she had envisioned for her favorite son and for her entire family. Shireen could not have known that her future and the future of her favorite son, Merog, would soon change in entirely unexpected ways. And we all are aware of some of that, but we're going to go into a lot of detail about that whole period from right here to when he leaves Upasni Maharaj's ashram, I believe, in January of 1921, I believe. And it's, boy, poor Shireen. I mean, you want to hear suffering and going through hell. This is all you mothers who've gone through hell, you're going to really like the story of Shireen. And that is pretty much what I've got. Any questions? This is Shireen at Pumpkin House. Probably, it must have been maybe in the 30s or something. I'm not sure. Yes.
How did one acquire land?
How do one acquire land? Purchase. I'm not sure.
Granted, or was it a grant that they received?
No. This time it was. I mean, it's still in India when you get out into the sort of the wild, out in the rural areas. Some people acquire land by just building a hut there and telling somebody, try to get me out. But Poona was.
Take it.
Sorry.
Yeah, just take the land, right? Just
Well, yeah,
acquire it.
in some places and sometimes, and
Yeah.
how that, when they say acquired land, there no doubt there was some areas that were not like claimed, and at that time they would have to go through the British government to figure that out. The cantonment land, I'm sure, was kind of like, this is ours, you better not do it. And so they would have to do some kind of business with the British government, and but with all the business they were doing, they could easily purchase the land, and then from there, as long as it was stamped by the British, and then once in the late 40s or mid 40s when the independence came, a lot of, as most sort of empire building people did, they just kind of took over the existing books and worked with what had been established by the British. That's purely speculative, but I think it's probably likely. Anyone? Thoughts, concerns, questions?
I think you're right that one way you got land was to just start living in it or sort of get it from somebody, and then however you needed to do that, convince the British that it was yours. And Kipling talks about this.
Yeah, and that's why squatters' rights are still respected.
Yeah.
And they were in Mehrabad, they put up fences and do things because they don't want, drive people off, because if they manage to establish themselves there, and they're concerned about that just even on the road, the domed road that goes by Lower Mehrabad, there are people setting up stands there, and they're concerned about it because they're. See, the thing is, it's growing so much that it's still, and even they have big troubles in Bombay because there's so many poor people. They would just put up little shanties on the side of the road, and before long, there's a whole hutment there. And at times, they've had to, to great outcries and protestations, they've had to actually take bulldozers and just bulldoze, tell them, 1 month from today we're going to do, and they keep going every day and tell them we're going to bulldoze this, we're going to bulldoze this, and one day they come in, they bulldoze everything, and people are weeping on the streets. But they set up this little shanty town in the middle of a street where they've got a train station coming in or something, and that's what happens. And that's the Indian government, so you can imagine what it was like in those days. Now, another interesting thing about the land is that in the stories about Hazrat Babajan, in that, I showed you that area in, see if I can find it again, in the cantonment. Yeah. Now, she was down this way, and Dr. Ghani, in his little life of Babajan, that is, it was printed originally in the not originally, it was printed, I think, originally in the Meher Baba journals that Elizabeth Patterson edited, and then reprinted in the Awakener. In any case, he describes that Babajan, when she sat under her tree, which is now where her tomb is, she was sitting in a field, and that might be why it's all white over on this side, because she was somewhere over here. And it was a field when she sat there, and she sat there for some 10 years and 20 years. But eventually, when people began to respect her, huge crowds would be formed around her. Well, if there's a huge crowd in India, somebody's going to set up a tea stall, and someone else is going to set up a sandwich stall, and so everything kind of grew out. And how they acquired that land, if they acquired from the British, or if the British tried to get Baba John out, and eventually they said, okay, she can stay there, but we got to put a fence so that people don't spill out onto the street. But under no circumstances can she be buried there. No question, because there'd be a tomb there. It's in the middle of the street. Draw crowds, and just can't. But then when she finally died, there was like a riot. There was like 5,000 people there, and there was no way they were going to stop them from burying her there. Because this also, you have to remember, was right at the pitched time when the independence movement was going. Everybody was just itching, and Pune was a hotbed for the independence movement and the movement and the Congress movement, and they didn't want to become an actual battleground, so they just said, let her build it. So now the tomb is still there. So.
Wasn't she sitting under a tree?
Sorry?
Wasn't she under a tree? Or
she was under a tree, yes, she was under a tree, but they said that they needed to build some kind of shelter for her. And if you ever went to her tomb in the 70s, now recently they've rebuilt it, which is a whole other story. But first of all, Mayor Baba contributed to the building of the tomb. When he died, he contributed money for that. But before that, when they said, and actually a description of this little building is in Paul Brunton's book, Search of Secret India. He went and saw her. And what they did, they said they had to build a shelter for her. So they built a shelter. They said they had to have a wall or a railing to keep people from spilling out into the street. Because now what had been a field, now there's commerce, and they didn't want it to. The British are very strict about these things. They would go nuts with this stuff. And I actually found some old newspaper clippings about British being outraged about it. But in any case, they said that she had to have a shelter, and so they built the shelter right next to the tree, and they told her that she had to just move over here 3 or 4 feet, and you got this nice shelter. She said, "Go to hell, I'm moving." So they had to, because it was order from the British, they had to build the structure around the tree. That's why if you went to the original tomb, the structure was actually built around the tree. And then some wealthy Arabs came in and some sneaky dealings went on, and they built a beautiful tomb, but this tree was still living. They cut the tree off at the top, killed the tree. A living witness of Baba John and of Mayor Baba's kiss and all that, and they just killed it and built a beautiful marble antique, and now they've got a beautiful dome on top of it. But such a price. So,
did you get all these sources in India? Is this stuff that you found?
Well, a lot of these pictures are, some of the pictures, most of them are from Lord Mayor.
Oh, yeah.
I just scanned them out of Lord Mayor. This one, for example, I scanned out of this book. It's called the Poona, the Queen of the Deccan. It's like a coffee table book. Beautiful history, lots of nice pictures. And this map was in that. A lot of my, talking about, most of the Shahriyar and Shireen stuff is in these 2 little booklets, but they're drawn from Lord Mayor. So you'll actually probably learn more from Lord Mayor, but there's so much in there, it's just easier to go right to those. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
In the classic story of Shahriyar, being in the street in the market with his sister, and she says, "Why don't you get married and settle down?" And the way I heard it initially is kind of throw off. He points to his future wife, his little 5-year-old girl, and say, "I would marry her, only her alone."
Yeah, only her alone.
Only when I'm married. Now,
Yeah.
I asked Monty, the question that always occurred to me was he merely trying to put her off, or did he intuitively sense that she was his destined wife? And I asked this to Monty, and Monty told me that it was her understanding that, in fact, he intuitively knew that this little girl was the one he was destined to marry. So he wasn't merely trying to throw her off. He kind of sensed that was going to happen. Are you in concert with that from what you know?
Well, none of that is articulated in the sources. None of that is spoken. It's always told that he was just fed up with her.
Monty said that she understood that her father was just in a kind of roundabout way choosing his wife, and he knew what was going to happen.
Well, and part of the story is, that he had heard this voice, and again, because that's so, first of all, if I'm going to be, an historical scholar, that's nowhere in the sources. I'm glad to hear you saying that story, and I've asked Glenn McGreeny and other people who have tapes of Monty if they, anything related to these things. I'd love to hear. If I have a tape of her saying that, if you had taped her, that would be a great resource. That'd be a terrific resource. But it's still as word of mouth. It's worth noting, but it's not as valuable to a historian as having an artifact. But it's certainly. To me, as long as I'm got my historian hat on, I gotta say no. So the thing that I was going to bring, which I forgot, is that in the early '70s, at some point, I don't know if you know Jack Mormon. Jack Mormon was going to India long ago, and Monty trusted him apparently, and she just came out with a big sack of coins, and she said, "These are all coins that my father saved. He worked in these, he had all these tea shops, and whenever we would find some just odd coin, he would just save it and look at them." And she said, "I want you to keep these, and someday when your center or the trust or something needs money, you can, do some fundraising or something and maybe sell these coins." So Jack has been doing that. I don't know if he's had any left, but I got one for $100. I got a coin. Date is like 1700. That was in Shahriyar's collection. So I was going to bring that, and I forgot. Maybe next time.
What from what country?
Yeah, I believe it's German, actually.
No.
Yes.
Tea shops that Shahriyar had, but Baba worked in toddy shops.
Yeah, he branched out into toddy shops eventually. When he first got married, he was just kind of doing. It was a very common Zoroastrian profession to have tea shops, and to have tea shops that served both the British. Well, I'm sure no British ever went into his tea shops, but to serve the Parsees. He also was a gardener. He was apparently an excellent gardener and worked for a very wealthy Parsee. So he did a lot of things.
Private estate?
And, pardon me?
He worked at a private estate? Was this wealthy Parsee?
Yeah, someone in Pune, someone with anybody who's a wealthy Parsee in Pune is going to have a big garden. Not like a huge estate, I don't believe. They don't specify, they just say a well-to-do or a wealthy Parsee. But, what was the other thing I was going to say? I had another, what was your question?
About the toddy shops.
Oh, the toddy shops, yeah. The toddy shops came later, and he ultimately had a string of toddy shops. He was becoming very, very wealthy, and so wealthy that he couldn't handle all the business, and he went into partnership with someone. And the partner, because he was just a trusting guy and wasn't paying attention, the partner wrote the contract, and the Shahriyar to sign it, and the contract said, "You now sign over all of your businesses to me." And the judge, everybody knew that the guy had ripped him off, but it was a legal contract, and they couldn't. Reportedly, Shahriyar, took it all in stride and said, "Oh, don't worry. I feel sorry for him. He's going to suffer so much in his next life." And Maureen said, God damn it, I don't care if he suffers in his next life. I want to see him suffer now."
Besides, he had a bag of coins.
Huh?
He had a bag of coins.
Yeah, he had a bag of coins that were from other countries that he couldn't sell mostly. But, yeah, so that is that. I'm happy to go on forever and ever, but any other thoughts, questions, ideas? All right, thank you all. Oh, and next time, let me just say, let's zip up ahead here, wait a minute. Not even sure when it is. Yeah, so next time, March 7th, Wednesday, March 7th, 7 p.m. at the Circle Center. We'll talk about religious experience and meeting his mentors from 1913 to 1921. January 1913, I believe, is when he first met Baba John, and January 1921 is when he left Upasni Maharaja's ashram to establish a Jyoti in Ferguson College Road, and that was his first gathering of disciples.